The silence in the grand ballroom of Valcour Manor wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of iron. When the tray slipped from the maid's trembling hands, shattering against the marble floor, the sound was like a gunshot. 300 guests froze, but they weren't looking at the broken china. They were looking at Darby Valcour, the recluse billionaire whispered to be a monster, a man who hadn't been seen in public for a decade. He didn't scream. He didn't fire her. He fell to his knees, staring at her face as if he were seeing a ghost, and whispered a single word that would tear the Brooks family apart. What happens when a poor girl accidentally wears the face of a vampire king's long-dead obsession? The answer is terrifying. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. Shania Brooks adjusted the collar of her trench coat, trying to shield the folder tucked under her arm from the relentless drizzle. The neon sign of the pharmacy flickered above her, buzzing like a dying insect. She wasn't just tired. She was exhausted in the way that settles deep in the marrow of your bones. Shania was 23, but her eyes held the weary caution of someone twice her age. Inside that folder were the latest medical bills for her mother, Margaret. The numbers were astronomical. Margaret Brooks had been the head housekeeper at the Valcour estate for 15 years. It was a job that paid well above the market rate, came with full benefits, and required absolute discretion. But 2 days ago, Margaret had collapsed in the laundry room. The doctors called it a cardiac event, triggered by extreme exhaustion, but Shania knew it was just the weight of the world finally crushing her mother's chest. "You can't go back, Mum," Shania had said earlier that morning, sitting by the hospital bed. The machines beeped a rhythmic, sterile tempo. Margaret, pale and hooked up to an IV drip, had tried to sit up, panic flaring in her eyes. "You don't understand, Shania. The contract. If I don't show up, I lose the pension. I lose the health insurance. We lose the house. I'll call them. I'll explain," Shania argued. "No." Margaret grabbed Shania's wrist with surprising strength. "You don't call the Valcours. You don't speak to them. You speak to Mrs. Graves, the staff manager. And you don't quit." She swallowed hard, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Shania, they are particular. If I lose this position, we have nothing. We can't afford this room for another hour without that insurance." The desperation in her mother's eyes broke Shania's resolve. There was only one solution, a temporary switch. It wasn't strictly legal, perhaps, but it wasn't uncommon in the world of high-end domestic staff for daughters to cover shifts. "I'll go," Shania said quietly. "I'll take your place until you're on your feet. Just tell me what to do." Margaret sank back onto the pillows, relief warring with a new, sharper fear. "Listen to me very carefully, Shania. The Valcour estate is not like other houses. There are rules that sound like superstitions, but you must follow them as if they are law." Shania had taken out a notepad. "Okay, tell me." "First," Margaret said, her breathing shallow, "you never go to the East Wing after sunset. Never. Second, you place the master's dinner on the dumbwaiter at 7 p.m. sharp. You do not deliver it to his room. And third, the most important rule," Margaret squeezed Shania's hand, "if you ever see Mr. Valcour, and you pray that you don't, you must never, under any circumstances, look him in the eye. You look at the floor. You bow your head. You become invisible. Do you understand?" "He's that much of a tyrant?" Shania asked, feeling a spark of anger. "He's a billionaire, not a god." "Promise me," Margaret hissed. "I promise." Now, standing before the massive iron gates of the Valcour estate, located on a private island just a ferry ride away from the city, Shania felt the promise weigh heavy on her chest. The estate was a sprawling Gothic revival mansion, dark stone rising against the grey sky like a jagged tooth. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress designed to keep something in. She buzzed the intercom. "Delivery for the service entrance?" A metallic voice crackled. "No," Shania said, steadying her voice. "I'm Shania Brooks. I'm here to sub for Margaret Brooks. I spoke to Mrs. Graves." There was a long pause. A camera mounted on the stone pillar swiveled, the lens focusing on her face with a mechanical whir. It lingered there for an uncomfortable amount of time. "Enter," the voice said. The gates groaned open. The walk up the driveway was a mile long, flanked by ancient, weeping willows that seemed to reach for her as she passed. When she finally reached the service entrance, a woman was waiting. She was tall, severe, wearing a pristine black suit that looked more like armor than a uniform. This was Mrs. Graves. "You're late," Mrs. Graves said, not looking at her watch. She was staring at Shania's face. Her expression was unreadable, but her pupils seemed to contract. "You look very much like your mother." "I'm here to work," Shania said, clutching her bag. "My mother is capable, but the doctor insisted on bed rest for a week. I know the routine. I've been briefed." Mrs. Graves stepped aside to let her in. The kitchen was immense, gleaming with stainless steel and copper, but it was strangely silent. There were other staff members, a sous chef chopping vegetables, a maid polishing silver, but they moved with hushed efficiency. No chatter, no radio. "Your mother is a senior maid," Mrs. Graves said, handing Shania a uniform. It was traditional, black with white trim, archaic, but high quality. "You will not have her rank, obviously. You will be restricted to the lower floors and the library maintenance. Do not speak to the other staff unless necessary regarding duties. And I assume Margaret told you the rules? No East Wing after dark. Dinner on the dumbwaiter. No eye contact," Shania recited. Mrs. Graves stopped walking. They were in a long, dimly lit corridor lined with portraits of people who looked severe and pale. Mr. Valcour values his privacy above all else. He suffers from a photosensitivity condition. He finds human interaction taxing. If you disturb him, you will be removed immediately, and your mother's pension will be revoked. Am I clear? "Crystal," Shania said. But as she walked away to change, Shania couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Graves hadn't been warning her about a grumpy boss. She had been warning her about a predator, and the way the older woman had looked at her, it wasn't scrutiny. It was pity. The first 3 days were a blur of labor. The Valcour estate was dusty, in the way that only old, large houses are. A fine, persistent silt that seemed to generate from the stone walls themselves. Shania scrubbed, polished, and vacuumed. She kept her head down. She learned the rhythm of the house. It was a cold house. Even with the heating on, drafts wandered through the halls like lost spirits. And it was nocturnal. During the day, the heavy velvet drapes remained drawn. The staff moved like shadows, but at night, the house seemed to wake up. On the 4th evening, a Tuesday, the routine broke. Shania was in the library, a massive 2-story room filled with books that smelled of vanilla and decay. She was on a ladder, dusting the upper shelves, when the storm hit. It was a violent coastal squall, thunder shaking the window panes. Suddenly the lights flickered and died. Total darkness engulfed the library. Shania froze on the ladder, gripping the wood. "Hello?" she called out. No answer. The backup generators usually kicked in instantly, her mother had said. But 10 seconds passed. 20. Then she heard it. Music. It was coming from the floor above, drifting down through the ventilation, or perhaps the floorboards themselves. A cello. Deep, mournful, and played with a technical proficiency that made the hair on Shania's arms stand up. It was a melody that sounded like weeping. Shania knew she should stay put. She knew the rules, but the darkness was absolute, and the storm outside was howling. She climbed down the ladder, feeling her way towards the door. She needed to find the breaker box, or Mrs. Graves. She stepped out into the hallway. The emergency lights were dead, too. Guided only by the flashes of lightning illuminating the tall windows, Shania moved towards the main staircase. The music was louder now. It was coming from the top of the stairs, the entrance to the East Wing. Never go to the East Wing, her mother had said, but the smell of smoke caught her attention. It was faint, acrid. A lightning strike? If there was a fire and the alarms were down due to the power outage, the master, whoever he was, could be in danger. Shania ran up the stairs. "Mr. Valcour!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "Is anyone there?" The cello stopped abruptly. Shania reached the landing. The double doors to the east wing were slightly ajar. The smell of smoke was stronger here. Not wood smoke, but something sweeter, like burnt sage or wax. Pushing the fear down, she shoved the doors open. The room beyond was a private study, illuminated by the dying embers of a fireplace and dozens of tall candelabras. The light was flickering, casting long, dancing shadows against walls covered in tapestries. And there he was, Darby Valcour. He was standing by the window, staring out at the raging storm. He wore a white dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and black trousers. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful, like a dormant panther. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the candlelight. He hadn't heard her enter, or if he had, he didn't care. "Sir," Shania whispered, I think there's a problem with the fuse box, and I smelled smoke." Darby went rigid. The tension in his shoulders was immediate and terrifying. He turned around slowly. Shania remembered the rule. Look at the floor. Be invisible. She immediately dropped her gaze to the Persian rug. "I apologize, sir. I'll leave immediately." "Look at me," a voice commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a voice that sounded like gravel grinding against velvet. Low, resonant, and vibrating war, with strange, compelling authority. I'm not supposed to, sir," Shania stammered, backing towards the door. "I said, look at me." Shania swallowed hard. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, defying every instinct of self-preservation, she lifted her chin. She looked him in the eye. She expected a monster. She expected scarring or deformity, the reason for his seclusion. Instead, she saw a face of devastating, cruel beauty. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes that were the color of storm clouds, grey with flecks of violet. But it wasn't his beauty that stopped her breath. It was the look on his face. Darby Valcour looked as if he had been shot. His eyes widened, his pupils blowing wide until the irises were almost gone. He took a staggering step back, knocking over a heavy side table. A crystal decanter shattered, spilling red liquid, wine, surely, across the floor like a blood splatter. "Impossible," he whispered. The word was choked out, breathless. He moved before she could blink. 1 second he was by the window. The next, he was standing directly in front of her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. He smelled of rain, old paper, and something metallic. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, searching her features with a frantic, hungry intensity. He looked at the curve of her jaw, the shape of her nose, the color of her eyes. "Eleanor," he breathed. The name hung in the air, heavy with a century of grief. Shania trembled, pinned by his gaze. No, sir. My name is Shania. Shania Brooks." Darby flinched as if she had slapped him. He closed his eyes tightly, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The veins in his neck were prominent, pulsing. He looked like a man fighting a violent internal war. "Brooks," he hissed, opening his eyes. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a cold, hard mask, but the shock remained. "Margaret's daughter!" "Yes, sir." He stepped back, putting distance between them, turning his face away from the candlelight. "Get out," he said, his voice straining. "Get out of this room. Get out of this wing." "Sir, Run!" he roared, the sound shaking the glass in the windows. Shania didn't wait. She turned and sprinted down the hallway, her heart pounding in her ears. The image of his haunted, violet eyes burned into her retina. She didn't stop running until she reached the safety of the servants' quarters in the basement, locking the door behind her. She slid down against the wood, gasping for air. She had broken the rules. She had looked him in the eye. But what terrified her wasn't his anger. It was the fact that for a split second, when he looked at her, he hadn't looked at a maid. He had looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Up in the east wing, Darby Valcour stared at the closed door. He brought a hand to his chest, feeling a heart that beat only once every few minutes, flutter into a rapid, painful rhythm. He picked up a small, framed painting from his desk. It was an oil portrait from 1924. The woman in the painting wore a flapper dress and pearls, smiling with a secret joy. She had Shania Brooks's face, exactly. down to the small mole above her left eyebrow. "You found me," he whispered to the silence. "After all this time, you found me." The morning sun did not penetrate the heavy velvet curtains of Valcour Manor, leaving the hallways in a perpetual state of twilight. For Shania, the daylight brought no relief, only a mounting sense of dread. She had barely slept, tossing on the narrow cot in the servants' quarters, the image of Darby Valcour's violet eyes haunting her darkness. She expected to be fired. She sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed in her crisp black uniform, waiting for Mrs. Graves to knock on the door and hand her a termination notice. She had looked the master in the eye. She had spoken to him. She had seen him in a state of undress and emotional ruin. At 7 a.m., the knock came. Shania jumped, her heart hammering. She opened the door to find Mrs. Graves standing there, looking more severe than usual. Her lips were a thin, pale line. "You are to report to the solarium immediately," Mrs. Graves said, her voice clipped. Shania gripped the doorframe. Am I being sent home?" Mrs. Graves' eyes narrowed, scanning Shania's face with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. "No. Mr. Valcour has requested your presence, specifically." She paused, lowering her voice. "In 20 years, he has never requested a specific maid. Be careful, girl. Whatever game you are playing, you are out of your depth." "I'm not playing a game," Shania whispered, but Mrs. Graves had already turned on her heel, marching away. Shania walked the long corridors to the solarium, a glass-walled room at the back of the house that faced the cliffs. Usually a solarium is bright, but here the glass had been treated with a heavy tint, turning the outside world into a dark, grey smear. Darby was sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair. He was fully dressed today in a charcoal three-piece suit that looked tailored in a different era, timeless, expensive, and imposing. A silver tea service sat untouched on the table beside him. "Close the door," he said without turning around. Shania obeyed, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. "Good morning, sir. Come closer." She approached slowly, stopping 3 feet away. She remembered the rule. Look at the floor. But before she could lower her head, he spoke. "No," he commanded softly. "Look at me. That rule no longer applies to you." Shania looked up. In the daylight, or what passed for it in this room, he looked even more inhumanly perfect. His skin was the color of marble, and there were dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in decades. He was studying her with a clinical, intense fascination. "Tell me about your father," Darby said. The question was abrupt. Shania blinked. "My father? He died before I was born. A car accident." "His name?" "Thomas Brooks." Darby's fingers drummed on the armrest of the chair. He seemed to be calculating, searching his memory. "Brooks, a common name. And your mother?" "Margaret. Has she ever spoken of her grandmother? A woman named Genevieve?" Shania paused. Genevieve. The name sounded strange on his tongue, spoken with a reverence that made the air in the room feel heavy. "No, sir. My mother doesn't talk much about her family history. We've always been just us." Darby stood up. He moved with a liquid grace that defied gravity. He walked around her, circling her like a predator inspecting a new exhibit. He stopped behind her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his body. "You have her walk," he murmured, his voice right at her ear. Shania shivered. "You have her pulse. I can hear it. It's frantic." He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder. He didn't touch her, but the air between his hand and her neck crackled with static electricity. "Sir, you're scaring me," Shania said, her voice trembling but firm. Darby pulled his hand back instantly. He walked to the tinted window, keeping his back to her. "Fear is a healthy response in this house, Shania. Keep it. It will keep you alive." He turned back, his face composed, the mask of the billionaire recluse back in place. "You will no longer work in the kitchens or the lower floors. From this moment on, you are assigned to the personal quarters. You will tend to the library, my study, and this room. You will answer only to Mrs. Graves and myself." "But the other staff," Shania began. She knew how this would look. The new girl, the temp, suddenly promoted to the most coveted position in the house. It would put a target on her back. The opinions of sheep should not concern the lion, Darby said coldly. Leave me. And Shania. She paused at the door. Yes, sir? Wear your hair down tomorrow. The bun. It doesn't suit you. Shania fled the room, her cheeks burning. As she hurried down the hall, she didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows of the linen closet, watching her leave the master's private sanctuary. It was Lydia, the head maid of the West Wing. Lydia had been working at Valcour Manor for 6 years, waiting for a chance to be noticed, to be promoted, to be seen. She watched Shania's retreating figure, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, venomous jealousy. So, Lydia whispered to the empty hall, the little mouse thinks she can steal the cheese. We'll see about that. The atmosphere in the staff dining hall that evening was toxic. Usually the staff ignored Shania, treating her as a temporary fixture not worth learning a name for. Tonight, however, the silence was loud. As Shania carried her tray to an empty corner table, she could feel the eyes on her. Whispers broke out behind cupped hands. Personal quarters? On her 4th day? I heard she was in there for 20 minutes. She's not even trained. It's an insult to Mrs. Graves. Lydia sat at the center of the main table, holding court. She was beautiful in a sharp, angular way, with blonde hair pulled back so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes. She was peeling an orange with a knife, the blade flashing under the fluorescent lights. Don't worry, Lydia said loud enough for the room to hear. These little flings never last. The master gets bored of his new toys, or they break. Shania kept her head down, shoveling the stew into her mouth. She just needed to finish the shift. She needed the paycheck for her mother's surgery. She could handle mean girls. But the next day, the harassment escalated from words to action. Shania was assigned to clean the grand gallery, a long hallway lined with priceless vases and oil paintings. It was a delicate job. Mrs. Graves had given her strict instructions. Use only the microfiber cloths. No water, no chemicals. Shania was wiping the dust from the frame of a 17th century landscape when Lydia entered. Miss Brooks, Lydia said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Mrs. Graves sent me. She said you need to use the polish on the floor. The master is expecting a guest this evening. A guest? Shania asked, confused. I thought he didn't see anyone. A business partner. Very important. The floor needs to shine. Here. Lydia kicked a bucket of soapy water and a mop toward Shania. It seemed plausible. Shania dipped the mop and began to wash the marble floor near the center of the gallery. The floor was slick, the water soapy. Oops, Lydia said. Before Shania could react, Lydia tripped, stumbling directly into a pedestal that held a Ming vase, blue and white porcelain, fragile as an eggshell. Lydia didn't just bump it, she shoved it. The vase teetered. Shania lunged forward to catch it, her feet slipping on the wet, soapy floor. She went down hard, her knees slamming into the marble. The vase tipped over the edge of the pedestal. Crash! The sound was explosive. Thousands of shards of ancient porcelain scattered across the wet floor. Silence followed. A terrible, ringing silence. Oh my God! Lydia gasped, stepping back, her face twisting into a mask of mock horror. Shania, what did you do? You clumsy idiot! That vase is worth more than your life! Within seconds, the doors burst open. Mrs. Graves rushed in, followed by Bruno, the head of security. What is the meaning of this? Mrs. Graves stopped, her face draining of color as she saw the shattered porcelain. She looked at Shania, who was on her knees, wet, bruised, and surrounded by the wreckage. She slipped, Lydia said quickly, pointing an accusing finger. I told her not to use so much water. I told her to be careful, but she was rushing. Mrs. Graves looked at Shania with cold fury. This is a Ming Dynasty artifact. It is irreplaceable. You are fired, Miss Brooks, and you will be hearing from our lawyers. Your mother's pension will be seized to pay for a fraction of this damage. No, Shania cried, tears stinging her eyes. Please, she told me to mop. She pushed it! Liar! Lydia shouted. Why would I destroy the master's property? Get her out of here, Mrs. Graves commanded Bruno. Throw her out the front gate. Bruno, a man the size of a refrigerator, stepped forward and grabbed Shania by the arm. His grip was bruising. He hauled her up like a rag doll. Stop! The word wasn't shouted, but it carried a force that rattled the windows. Darby Valcour stood at the far end of the gallery. He wasn't looking at the broken vase. He wasn't looking at Mrs. Graves. He was looking at Shania's arm, where a small shard of porcelain had sliced her skin. A single drop of bright red blood was trickling down her wrist. The air in the room instantly dropped 20 degrees. Darby walked toward them. He moved so smoothly it looked like he was gliding. He stopped in front of Bruno. Unhand her, Darby said. His voice was a low growl, vibrating with a primal threat. Bruno let go immediately, stepping back, looking terrified. Darby looked at the shattered vase, then at Lydia. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. You are lying, Darby said to Lydia. Lydia stammered. Sir, I saw her. I can smell the adrenaline on you, Darby said, stepping closer to Lydia. He towered over her. I can smell the deceit, and I can smell the soap you put in the bucket, a bucket you brought from the supply closet 5 minutes ago. Lydia froze. You destroyed something of mine to hurt her, Darby whispered. You have broken the harmony of my house. He turned to Mrs. Graves. Lydia is to be removed from the island within the hour, without a reference, without severance. If she ever sets foot in Seattle again, ensure she is arrested for destruction of private property. Lydia's legs gave out, and she began to sob, but Bruno was already dragging her away. Darby turned to Shania. The rage in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dark, consuming hunger. He reached out and took her injured hand. His touch was freezing, but gentle. He brought her wrist up to his face. For a terrifying second, Shania thought he was going to bite her. His eyes were focused on the bead of blood, his pupils blown wide, swallowing the grey irises. His lips parted. Mrs. Graves gasped audibly. Darby froze. He seemed to snap back to reality, fighting for control. He lowered her hand slowly, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket and wrapping it around the cut. You are bleeding, he said, his voice strained, as if he were in pain. Mrs. Graves, take Miss Brooks to the infirmary. Ensure she is treated by Dr. Aris. No one else. Yes, sir, Mrs. Graves said, her voice shaking. And Shania? Darby looked at her, his eyes burning. Do not clean the floors again. You are not here to clean. What am I here for, then? Shania asked, her voice barely a whisper. Darby looked at her for a long moment, a sadness so deep it felt like a physical weight filling the room. To remember, he said. He turned and walked away into the shadows, leaving Shania standing amidst the ruins of the vase, the silk handkerchief bound tight around her wrist, stained with a single spot of blood that the vampire king had almost tasted. Dr. Aris was a man who looked like he had been preserved in formaldehyde. He was thin, precise, and smelled of antiseptic and clove cigarettes. As he stitched the cut on Shania's wrist in the sterile white infirmary, he didn't ask how it happened. He just hummed a tune that sounded disturbingly like the cello music Shania had heard in the storm. He likes you, Dr. Aris said, snapping his latex gloves off. That is unfortunate for you. Shania winced as he applied a bandage. He saved me. He stopped Lydia. He protected an investment, Aris corrected, peering at her over his spectacles. Darby Valcour does not save people, Miss Brooks. He collects them, and once he has collected you, he does not let go. You should take your mother's pension and run while the gates are still open. But Shania couldn't run. The paycheck for this week alone was enough to cover 2 months of her mother's heart medication. She was trapped by poverty, if not by the man himself. That afternoon, Shania was sent to the master's private study in the East Wing. Her instructions were specific. Dust the books. Do not read them. The study was a treasure trove of history. There were first editions of Dickens, maps of the world before the borders were drawn, and strange artifacts encased in glass. But Shania was drawn to the desk. It was a massive slab of mahogany, cluttered with papers. Darby was not there. Mrs. Graves had said he was resting, preparing for the centennial gala that was to take place the following night. Apparently, the reclusive billionaire was finally opening his doors to the city's elite for the first time in a decade. As Shania dusted the desk, her cloth snagged on a slightly raised panel of wood on the desktop. It was a hidden drawer. The latch had been jarred loose, perhaps when Darby had knocked over the table during their first encounter. Curiosity, that fatal flaw, took over. Shania pried the panel open. Inside lay a single book. It wasn't a printed volume. It was a leather-bound journal, the leather cracked and worn with age. Embossed on the cover in gold leaf were the initials GBGB Genevieve Brooks, her great-grandmother? Shania's heart raced. She opened the book. The pages were yellowed, filled with elegant, looping handwriting. The first entry was dated October 4th, 1923. I met him today, the master of the house. He is terrifying, yet I cannot look away. He moves like smoke. He says his name is Darby, but the staff calls him the Undying. I fear I have fallen in love with a ghost. Shania flipped forward, her hands trembling. December 24th, 1923. He told me the truth tonight. He showed me what he is. I should have screamed. I should have fled into the snow. But when he kissed me, I felt only cold fire. He offered me eternity. He wants to turn me, to make me like him. March 15th, 1924. I cannot do it. I want to live in the sun. I want children. I want to grow old. I told him I am leaving. He wept. I have never seen a monster weep. He swore he would wait for me. He swore that even if I die, he would find me again. He says souls like ours are tethered. A photograph slipped from the back of the book. Shania picked it up and gasped, dropping her duster. The photo was black and white, grainy, taken in a garden. A woman sat on a stone bench, laughing. She was wearing a 1920s drop-waist dress. It was Shania's face. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was identical. The same arch of the brow, the same dimple in the chin. It was like looking in a mirror that reflected the past. She chose a mortal life, a voice said from the shadows. Shania spun around, clutching the diary to her chest. Darby was standing in the doorway. He wasn't angry. He looked resigned, leaning against the frame with a weariness that made him look ancient. She left me to grow old, Darby said, walking slowly into the room. She married a carpenter. She had a daughter, your grandmother. She died of pneumonia in 1985. I was there. I watched from the window of the hospital. She was grey and wrinkled, but she was still beautiful to me. You. Shania backed away until she hit the desk. You're him. You're the same man. I am. You're a vampire, she whispered. The word felt ridiculous, childish, yet it was the only explanation that fit the cold skin, the aversion to light, the century-old grief. Darby stopped a foot away from her. I am Valcour. I am the keeper of this house, and I have waited 90 years for the timeline to circle back. He reached out and took the diary from her frozen hands. He placed it gently on the desk. Why me? Shania asked, tears spilling over. I'm just a maid. I'm just here to pay bills. I'm not her. Darby looked at her with an intensity that burned. Aren't you? You have her blood. You have her face. And when you looked at me in the storm, you didn't see a monster. You saw a man, just like she did. He leaned in, his cool breath ghosting over her lips. Tomorrow night is the centennial ball. I am reopening the estate to society. I want you there. I don't have a dress, Shania stammered, her mind spinning. I'm a servant. You will serve, Darby said, his eyes darkening. But you will not be a servant. You will be the test. If you can walk among the wolves and not bleed, then perhaps you are strong enough to stay. He turned away. Go, get rest. Tomorrow, Valcour Manor wakes up. And so will you. The night of the gala arrived with a parade of luxury cars that stretched from the ferry terminal to the manor gates. The quiet island was invaded by the glitter and noise of Seattle's ultra-wealthy. The grand ballroom was transformed. Thousands of white roses adorned the pillars. Crystal chandeliers, usually dim, blazed with light. An orchestra played waltzes on a raised dais. Shania stood in the prep kitchen, her hands shaking. She wasn't wearing the standard maid uniform. Mrs. Graves had handed her a dress that Darby had commissioned. It was a maid's uniform, technically, black with a white apron, but the silk was of the highest quality, fitted perfectly to her waist. The neckline was modest but elegant. It was a costume, really. A costume of servitude designed to make her stand out, not blend in. "Remember," Mrs. Graves said, adjusting Shania's collar. The older woman looked pale. "Serve the high table only. Pour the wine. Do not speak unless spoken to. And for God's sake, girl, don't trip." Shania took the heavy silver tray laden with crystal glasses and a vintage bottle of Cabernet, or what the label claimed was Cabernet. She pushed through the swinging doors and entered the ballroom. The noise hit her like a physical wave. Laughter, clinking glass, the swell of violins. 300 people in tuxedos and gowns swirled around the dance floor. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, sat the high table. Darby sat in the center. He looked like a king from a dark fairy tale. He wore a tuxedo with tails, his hair slicked back, his face unreadable. Seated around him were 6 other individuals, men and women who possessed the same predatory stillness as him. The business partners. The inner circle. Shania navigated the crowd. She felt eyes on her. People paused in their conversations to look. "Is that the new help?" "She looks familiar. My God, she looks like the portrait in the East Hall." Shania kept her eyes fixed on the high table. She reached the platform and began to serve. She moved to the guest on Darby's right, a woman with hair like spun silver and eyes that looked like broken glass. "Vintage 1924, the woman purred, sniffing the air as Shania uncorked the bottle. "A good year for harvest." Shania poured the wine. Her hand was steady. She moved to Darby. He didn't look at her. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. It was as if he was waiting for something. As Shania leaned in to pour his wine, the guest on his left, a man with a cruel scar running down his cheek, suddenly spoke. "So, Darby," the man sneered, "is this the replacement? A little common, isn't she?" Genevieve had fire. "This one just smells of soap and fear." The man reached out and grabbed Shania's wrist. His grip was like a vice, cold and hard as stone. "Let go," Shania gasped, the tray wobbling in her other hand. "Show us your face, girl," the man hissed. "Let's see if the copy is as good as the original." He yanked her arm. Shania lost her balance. The heavy silver tray tipped. Smash! The sound silenced the orchestra. The crystal glasses shattered against the marble floor. The bottle exploded, sending a wave of dark red wine splashing across the pristine white tablecloth and onto Darby's tuxedo. The entire ballroom went dead silent. 300 guests froze. Shania stood there, horrified. The wine looked like blood pooling at Darby's feet. She had humiliated him. She had ruined the gala. She waited for the anger. She waited to be destroyed. The scarred man laughed. "Pathetic, clumsy little thing. You should drain her, Darby, and be done with it." Darby slowly stood up. He didn't look at the wine. He didn't look at the scarred man. He turned to Shania. She was trembling so hard she thought her legs would give out. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, sir." Darby looked at her tears. His expression shattered. The cold mask fell away, revealing a raw, terrifying desperation. He fell to his knees. A gasp ripped through the crowd. The Darby Valcour, the tyrant, the billionaire, the monster, was on his knees in front of a maid. He reached out, ignoring the broken glass that cut into his palms, and took her hands. "Do not apologize," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "Never apologize for existing." He looked up at the scarred man, his eyes flashing a violent, glowing violet. "Touch her again, Marcus," Darby said, his voice dropping to a demonic growl that made the chandeliers rattle, "and I will tear your head from your shoulders in front of this entire assembly." He turned back to Shania, his gaze softening instantly. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles stained with wine. "Ladies and gentlemen," Darby said, still kneeling, looking out at the stunned crowd. "I introduced this evening as a celebration of the past. I was wrong." He stood up, pulling Shania with him, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. He looked at the room with a challenge in his eyes. "This is not my servant," Darby announced. "This is Shania Brooks, and she is the future mistress of Valcour Estate. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. And you all know, I do not forgive disrespect." Flashbulbs began to pop. The silence broke into a roar of whispers. Shania looked up at Darby, her heart pounding. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "They'll eat me alive." Darby looked down at her, a small, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "Let them try. The wolf does not fear the dogs when he has found his mate." But as the crowd buzzed, Shania saw the scarred man, Marcus, slip away into the shadows. He wasn't scared. He was smiling. He pulled a phone from his pocket and typed a single message. "The weakness has been confirmed. Initiate the hunt." The flashbulbs were blinding, but the darkness waiting outside the Valcour estate was far more dangerous. "We have to leave. Now," Darby whispered, his grip on Shania's arm tightening. He didn't wait for her to answer. He swept her off the dais, cutting a path through the stunned crowd. The guests parted like the Red Sea, their whispers following them like a swarm of bees. They burst out of the ballroom doors into the cool night air. The valet stand was empty. The line of luxury cars sat silent. "Where is the driver?" Shania asked, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Darby stopped. He sniffed the air, his upper lip curling back to reveal the hint of a fang. Wrong scent. Old blood. Before Shania could ask what he meant, the shadows detached themselves from the weeping willows. 5 figures stepped into the moonlight. In the center stood Marcus, the scarred man from the high table. He was holding something that made Shania's blood run cold. Her mother's locket. "Margaret sends her regards," Marcus sneered, tossing the silver locket onto the gravel. She was quite talkative before she expired. "No!" Shania screamed, lunging forward, but Darby caught her, pulling her behind his solid frame. "You broke the truce, Marcus," Darby said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You touched the staff. You entered my territory. You broke the law first, Valcour," Marcus shouted, his face contorting. "You're bonding with a human who carries her blood. You think we don't know? If you turn her, you become unstoppable. We can't let the king have his queen back." Marcus snapped his fingers. "Kill him. Keep the girl." The 4 figures blurred into motion. They weren't human. They moved with supernatural speed, closing the distance in a heartbeat. Darby didn't flinch. "Shania, get to the chapel. Run." He shoved her toward the stone path leading to the family crypts and turned to face the attackers. Shania scrambled back, watching in horror as Darby caught the first attacker by the throat mid-air. With a sickening crunch, he tossed the body aside like a rag doll. But there were too many of them. Marcus was circling, waiting for an opening. Shania ran. She sprinted through the dark gardens, her silk dress tearing on the rose thorns. She could hear the sounds of the fight behind her. Growls, the snapping of bone, the unearthly thud of bodies hitting stone. She reached the old stone chapel at the edge of the cliffs. The heavy oak doors were locked. She pounded on them, looking back. Marcus was there. He stood 10 feet away, blood smeared on his tuxedo shirt. He wasn't looking at the chapel. He was looking at her neck. "He's busy," Marcus smiled, revealing jagged, shark-like teeth. "He can't save you this time. I'm going to drain you dry, Shania, and when he finds your husk, he will finally break." He lunged. Shania didn't have a weapon. She didn't have super strength, but she had the diary. She remembered a passage she had read earlier that day, an entry from 1924 about the rivals of the West. "They are strong," Genevieve had written, "but they are vain. They cannot see their own reflection without freezing in horror of what they have lost." It was a long shot, a myth, but it was all she had. As Marcus flew at her, Shania didn't cower. She reached into the pocket of her dress where she had shoved her phone. She whipped it out, switched the camera to selfie mode, and thrust the screen directly into Marcus's face, screaming, Look at yourself! It shouldn't have worked. It was modern technology against an ancient monster, but Marcus, fueled by vanity and madness, instinctively focused on the glowing screen. He saw his own face, distorted, scarred, monstrous in the digital light. For a split second, he hesitated. He flinched. That second was all Darby needed. A black blur slammed into Marcus from the side. Darby drove the scarred vampire into the stone wall of the chapel with the force of a freight train. The impact cracked the masonry. Darby didn't hesitate. He didn't monologue. He ripped a heavy iron sconce from the wall and drove the sharp end through Marcus's chest, pinning him to the stone. Marcus gasped, his eyes wide, before he dissolved into ash and dust, leaving only his empty tuxedo on the ground. Darby fell to his knees, panting. His suit was shredded, his skin bruised and healing before her eyes. He looked wild, terrifying, and utterly exhausted. Shania slowly lowered the phone. She walked toward him. She should have been running away. She should have been terrified. But all she felt was an overwhelming pull. "You—" Darby looked up, his violet eyes fading back to a stormy grey. "You fought back. I told you," Shania said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm not just a maid." Darby stood up slowly. He reached out, touching her face with a reverence that made her knees weak. "No, you are not." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. "Margaret is safe," he whispered against her skin. "I had Bruno move her to a private clinic in Zurich an hour ago. Marcus lied to provoke you. She is alive." Shania let out a sob of relief, clutching his ruined jacket. "Why?" she asked. "Why go through all this for me?" Darby pulled back, looking deep into her eyes. The storm had passed, leaving only a calm, infinite sea. "Because for 90 years I have existed in a world of grey," he said softly. "You are the only colour I have ever seen." He took her hand and led her to the edge of the cliff, overlooking the churning ocean. The sun was beginning to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold. Usually he would retreat. He would hide from the light. But today, he stood there. He held her hand as the first rays of the sun hit them. His skin didn't burn. It shimmered, faint and diamond hard. "The curse is broken," Darby whispered, amazed. "Love, true love, was the anchor." He turned to her, and for the first time he smiled, a genuine human smile. "Shania Brooks, will you do me the honor of firing Mrs. Graves?" Shania laughed, the sound carrying over the waves. "I think I'd rather give her a raise. She has to clean up that ballroom." "Done," Darby said. He kissed her, and as the sun fully rose, the staff of Valcour Manor watched from the windows, shocked to see their master standing in the light, holding the maid who had become a queen. The poor girl had replaced her mother, but she had done much more than that. She had replaced the darkness with light. The story of Shania and Darby proves that destiny often arrives in the most unexpected disguises, sometimes wearing a maid's uniform and carrying a tray of shattered glass. Shania didn't just inherit a job. She inherited a legacy of courage that broke a century-old curse. From the terrifying silence of the library to the blood-soaked finale on the cliffs, she proved that true power isn't about immortality or wealth. It's about the bravery to look a monster in the eye and see the man underneath. Darby found his humanity not in the shadows, but in the light of a girl who refused to be afraid. Enjoyed this vampire romance saga? If Shania's journey kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It helps us create more dramatic stories for you. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good plot twist, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next part of our darker fairy tales. What would you do if you found that diary? Let us know in the comments below.